Go over to Instagram. We are officially almost live. Live in some of the places. What I'm doing is I'm waiting for Instagram to go live. And here we go. Hello, world. I am Vivi Henriette of Art of the Zodiac here with a dear friend of mine who I haven't caught up with in a long time. So this is going to be a really fascinating conversation. Spencer Michaud. How are you today?
Hey, how you doing, Vivi? Nice to see you. I'm doing okay, hanging in there.
You are like the calm presence that I want to embody after these eclipses.
am I the dad presence that everyone needs? Well, explain that to me.
I wasn't gonna go there, but like maybe in the best way possible. Like
I shared on Instagram like I love it when you call me Big Papa because I thought it was kind of funny. You kind of surprised me with the dad astrology, but
it's
I'll
dad astrology, but now it's really funny because it reads like dad astrology.
I thought it was dad astrology. What is Dada astrology?
You know, like it's irreverent. Like my friend Jason, who's technically the co-host, who sometimes shows up, does this with me, and we were like, oh, how do we have like an astrology podcast that fits our really like ADD tech, sensibilities? And you just think of like Dada art, right? It's kind of like nonsensical, but it packs a punch. But also I like the fact that it reads like dad astrology, which is totally
well, I've just gone through the last few hours having an existential crisis about like, all right, am I just at this stage of my life now that I'm just the dad guy, like, which is hilarious, but I'll own it. I'm a Cancer sun, so like, I have some dad vibes to me for sure.
I think that's the new direction, like only dads. It feels good. Do you ever get like side, just like
you froze up.
Oh, did I freeze up? Okay, am I back yet?
I lost you.
Oh.
You still there?
I'm still here.
Are we back?
I'm back. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Oh, wow. Someone wrote me this morning, a friend of mine was like, oh man, Mercury's already gotten me on their day. And I was like, it's Carl. It's like, please don't tell me this about Mercury. Carl's coming in asking for parenting advice. Maybe we just change the whole topic of this show. Like post eclipse. Can you give us some parenting advice?
I think that the main thing I learned being a parent is that you got to check your ego at the door. And I think that there will always be a way that being a parent will humble you and, make you realize all the things that you don't know. But I think, seriously though, consistency was the key for me in my journey. And then learning when to let go and when to like get out of the way. I think those two things, if you really need parenting advice, those are my two big ones that I think worked for me for the most part.
Oh my God. Like, that's like perfect what I needed to hear at the end of this eclipse. I feel like I've had like an ego death. So your parenting advice is good eclipse integration.
Yeah, this was a doozy of an eclipse, wasn't it? Like, right on the exaltation degree of Aries. I want to get your thoughts on this too, because I'm thinking about that eclipse. A lot of astrologers have been talking about it being a place of empowerment, right? With like the sun and Aries and things of that nature. But my curiosity is the sun was actually eclipsed. It was like basically shut off. So I'm almost wondering like, well, is this, through happenstance and fortune, not necessarily by choice, that we're being thrust into individuation rather than it being like this conscious choice that would be related to the sun? It's more related to like, all right, now here's a situation where you better figure it out on your own, because the help that you had before isn't available to you,
Oh, it's funny. And I'll just like share, I will, without getting too personal, but I have the sun at 0 degrees Aries and my midheaven is at 19 degrees Aries. Just at that degree with and so we had the eclipse and then Chiron. And just the thing that kept coming up for me, and I would say this personally, but also like surrounded by a lot of people who are really affected by this eclipse, there was this feeling of like, just like sit in the dark and look at yourself, right? Like that sincere like ego death. It's like if you figure out like, in order to figure out like what is it you really want, but in order to do that, it's like this total breakdown of like, yeah, like at this moment of being like, sit in the dark and just look at yourself. And you're like, that's fucking hard.
Yeah, definitely.
That's not fun.
And it was really close to the North Node in Aries also. So, they think of the North Node as this hungry demon or hungry dragon who had had his head severed after consuming the elixir of immortality. So it's almost like a hunger that is really difficult to satisfy, that can expand into great proportions. So to me, it feels like by shutting off the ego, the true underlying desires of that we have as individuals for our own selfish desires could bubble to the surface and be like, oh, you need to be aware of this. This is something that you actually want internally and intuitively, rather than, and you might not even be aware of it. I've been talking to a lot of my Libra friends, like Libra rising, Libra placements, and this eclipse cycle and this North and South node placement is really challenging them because they're so used to asking permission about what everyone else wants, and they're like, well, I really want this. This is something that I really want, and I'm just going to do it, but it feels weird. And I'm like, well, that's how this goes. Sometimes the astrology is pushing us to grow in different directions. And, one additional insight that I've had over this eclipse season is just thinking a lot about how we are or how we are not our charts. And I'm thinking about the chart and looking at it more as a series of events, like the planets as series of events. And the way that our character gets shaped through those events is through having a response, whether it's a trauma response or a character building response after experiencing that type of event over and over and over again in our life, because it's circular and these things are touching on it. And that to me is actually really empowering, because not only do we understand how we have shaped those types of experiences and character traits, but we can, unlearn doing something just by rote, like, and that to me is very empowering. Like, just because the planet is influencing us towards some sort of action, we don't necessarily have to listen to it, right? I think that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, like the feeling too, and I think that's the beauty of astrology is like, knowing, like, even thinking about 19 years ago when we had this same eclipse cycle, right? Like, where were you in your life? And like, I don't know, with me and thinking like, okay, like when it happened last time, I made certain choices. And even though it feels painful, I get to make new choices. And I think astrology is a bit like that. It's like, you're going to keep getting the things until you figure out like the proper way to do it.
Well, and if we take that logic forward with this eclipse, just because there are individual desires bubbling up within us does not mean that we have to run roughshod over all of our relationships to get those needs met. Yeah. Like, I like Joy Usher. Have we talked about Joy Usher in A Tiny Universe before? Oh,
and by the way, can I just like take a moment? You introduced me to that book, and I think she is so slept on. Like the fact, like everyone.
So good.
So good.
Yeah, she's from Australia, and she's an incredible traditional astrologer and really contextualizes things in interesting ways. And she talks a lot about the difference between Mars in Aries versus Mars in Scorpio, and the how Mars is feeding those two temples or countries. I like to think of the signs as countries on some level, like territories. Yeah. And she talks about Mars, in Aries, individuating and not necessarily being concerned with the collateral damage that might cause. And then with because it is trying to like sever the umbilical cord or sever from the collective to individuate, and sometimes it's going to just be like a giant battle axe, like, thrashing around, right? But like Scorpio is a little bit different. Scorpio is severing the spirit from the body and from form to be able to reborn into a new form. And that
Mm,
requires more of like a scalpel or like a ninja star or something where,
yeah.
you know, you're defending the dying life force. So you need to kind of be very precise, and there's precision with it, and there's secretiveness to it when you're going to war or battle or trying to sever a form. So I think that just because we're influenced by an eclipse that may bring out the desire to get our own way, we have to be cognizant of that fact and say, well, how do we, even though we've got a battle axe in our hands and we're closing our eyes. I mean, that's really what it's like. It's like we've got this axe in our hands, and now our eyes are being closed. Usually we can see where we're going, but now we're just like thrashing around, you know. And I think that this is an opportunity to like slow down and say, well, okay, maybe you don't have your eyes right now, but you can use other senses. You know, you can use your other intuitive faculties to allow you to, you know, get to the point that you need to be.
Yeah, I love that image of thrashing around in the dark.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like everyone has just been like, I know I've been talking nonstop about this month because it's been so much. But I'm curious two things to bring up with you. One, because I know you work a lot with the decans, I'd be interested to explore that April 8th eclipse from like a decanic story. And then also just kind of to put out there, and I'm sure we'll get to it in a moment, like it's really fascinating that, right, this talking about the Aries energy, we had this sort of thrashing around in Aries, and that the lunation cycle to bring us out of the eclipse is, of course, the like full moon in Scorpio. So thinking about how we're getting both of those martial stories this
Yeah.
month.
Yeah. The decanic story with the Aries eclipse, you know,
Yeah.
is related to, you know, I know you like tarot, so I'll bring out the tarot
Mhm.
card associated with it. It's the Three of Wands. So we've got the Three of Wands here, and that specific decan is ruled by the sun. It's one of the most solar royal decans in the zodiac, right? A lot of that is because there's a number of constellations that are projected out from the ecliptic that are associated with royalty, like Cassiopeia and Cepheus, the king, Andromeda, the princess. All of those are in that area, so that adds to that story. So this decan is really about, I think of it as royal decrees, like where you are saying, all right, I've severed and separated myself from a collective consciousness in Aries 1, which is a very martial decan. It's Mars ruled. And then you are becoming aware of who you are as an individual versus how you are not separate from the parent collective. So like in Aries 1, we're saying, I'm not this. Like I'm rejecting this so that I
Yeah.
can be myself. And then in Aries 2, you're saying, okay, well, here's who I am. Here's what I believe in. Here are my ethics. Here's how I want to lead. Then when you move into Aries 3, which is a Venus ruled decan, you're kind of saying, all right, here's who I am. Wouldn't it be nice to come follow me here? Like, here's the, like, wouldn't it be attractive to go the way that I'm going type of thing? So I think that those are really interesting ways of thinking about, you know, this eclipse is how can we make declarative statements about who we are without insisting that others follow. I think that that's actually one of the gifts of Aries. I think that when an Aries is really confident and like secure within themselves, they don't need other people to do what they're doing. They're just like, I'm just going to be me and you can be you. And that's
Yeah.
great. Like, you know?
You know, it's interesting speaking to, I mean, I'm like part of, fortunately, regardless, I'm a very sort of, I'm more on the Aries side. So it's hard for me sometimes to think about like my Libra friends, but I have noticed something you mentioned earlier, thinking about that idea of individuation coming, like being secure in oneself and just being like, yeah, like, of course, I'm just going to do the thing and not even like thinking about it, right? That like Aries energy of just like that growth that takes, it's almost like the flow state. It's like, I have no time to think of anyone else. It's just, this is the thing. And I have noticed a lot of people with like Libra placements really struggling because suddenly they're like, wow, like this is the thing that I want, but then having to reconcile with, if I do the thing that I want, I'm going to have to like break this contract, whether that be an actual contract or an unspoken like relationship contract. And yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any like thoughts on that. Even interesting to think about the opposite, right? So the
Yeah.
second decan of Libra and how those two speak to each other.
Yeah, oaths and contracts are really good key words for that second 10-degree section of Libra.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's opposite is bringing in energy of understanding the binding agreements that we have with others. That's a
Mm,
Saturn ruled 10-degree section. So, Libra is very cognizant of its commitments to other people and how their actions are going to affect other people. And this is one of the reasons why Mars is in its exile in Libra, because
yeah.
generally, for Mars to do what Mars desires to do, it needs to like head towards a target with singular focus, singularity of focus. Like that's why we have Aries as this extreme yang energy that is sort of like a seed trying to bust through the surface to be able to spread its leaves.
Yeah.
And when you have Libra, you're kind of always taking into account other people's opinions, other people's needs, desires, etc., which makes it very difficult to take the steps towards what you want. Liz Greene has some great stories about Libra that talk about making choices, like where we have the story of Paris and
Mm,
the golden apple. And Libra is indecisive, according to Liz Greene, because they understand the consequences of not choosing the other choices, right? Do
uh,
you see what I'm saying? Like, because in
yeah.
that story, like Paris had a kind of a no-win situation. He was gonna anger two goddesses with his choices and feel their wrath, and that was something that could have been kind of difficult. So, yeah, that the dichotomy between those things is really interesting.
Yeah, I feel that I'm curious because you're a consulting astrologer, so you get to see, you're seeing people all the time. And it does feel like this month, I'm just like processing, right? There's been a lot of like, it's been like the breakup eclipse, like
Sure.
lots of breakups, whether people are breaking up with like friends or partners or like jobs. I feel like everyone is breaking up with something. And maybe part of that story has been a little bit of like anguish of like having to like balance thoughts of like, I know I did what I needed to do, but then also the sort of like heavy remorse of like, what if? I don't know. Are you getting that in your client practice?
Yeah, I mean, and you can look at the eclipse that happened prior to the new moon solar eclipse, as we had a full
Yeah.
moon lunar eclipse in Libra. So to be able to make that new start, sometimes a relationship that we came to rely on has to end,
Yeah.
and sometimes that's not somebody's choice either. Like that's why I was saying, like sometimes when we have eclipse season, one of those lights is basically shut off. And in the full moon lunar eclipse, it's the moon that's being shut off, so you get some clarity. Like you're able to detach from emotions to get clarity about what you
Mm,
want, and that probably is the ending of the relationship because you finally got clarity and you're releasing that emotional attachment. And then with this particular eclipse, maybe since that relationship ended, it's difficult to, you might not know where you're going. You might be swinging blindly. You're like, I know that I have to take care of myself, but I don't know what the hell to do. Like, so that could be part of that energy as well. And yeah, I think that Aries season, it's been a really interesting one for individuating and figuring out what direction we want to go. And we're not completely out of the woods with all of it yet, right?
I mean, it's one of the things I want to also, maybe this is a chance to go there, but thinking about when you're coming out of eclipse season, right? The lunation that follows is really significant. It's like the pathway out. And so with this one, we just had the Scorpio full moon, which feels like both, I guess, like a way out, but more of a continuation. I would just really love your thoughts on that lunation.
The Scorpio, I'm just looking at the charts while I'm thinking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
this. I like contextualizing it within that. Um, Scorpio full moon, the way that I've been experiencing it is through releasing old attachments that were making it difficult to feel comfortable within our bodies in particular.
Mm,
Um, my own personal experience of that full moon has been realizing that I have some digestive challenges, sort of like, IBS type stuff, and learning that there's certain foods that I just can't eat and that I'm cutting them out of my diet completely. And honestly, it's sort of a revelation. Like it's releasing something that has been bringing me pain for a number of years. So I think that that is an example of the type of energy that Scorpio 1 might bring about, is releasing ourselves from a form or something that we're consuming or something that we hunger for that doesn't necessarily bring us vitality and life. So Scorpio, the way the Scorpio decans tend to work is you've got another Mars decan at the beginning of Scorpio. Then you have another solar decan. It's the same order: Mars, Sun, Venus. But in this case, we're severing the spirit from the body, and then we are alchemizing the change. We're fermenting. We're returning it back to the earth. Sometimes revisiting things in the second decan of Scorpio, just so we can extract the final essence from it, like we're making wine or something like that. Yeah. And then in the final decan, if we're doing it right, we're letting go of that form completely and being reborn. But a lot of times what happens in that final decan of Scorpio, which is Venus rule, is we glamorize the old form and we're doing everything in our power to keep it alive. I like that. Think of that decan as like the vampire decan, where, you know, sometimes you see that the vampires are doing more and more evil to be able to keep their physical forms alive, you know? And it's true in our own lives. Like, we struggle in Western civilization with the death process. We're all about growth, and we're all about unlimited growth all the time. And I don't think we take enough time to honor the process of giving back form to the earth, to spirit, whatever it is, to be able to regenerate new healthy forms. When we hang on and we keep trying to grow, like here's an example of farming. You keep trying to grow on land over and over and over without letting the land rust. Eventually that land becomes exhausted and it doesn't provide any nutrients anymore. So the process of giving that organic matter back to the earth actually creates that future flowering, that future vitality, those future nutrients. So I'm hoping that this full moon will help us identify the things that are getting in the way of healthy new manifestations, because we have a really awesome, I think, Taurus new moon coming in May. So that I feel pretty good about that. Like we're right in this full moon also is coming off the heels of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which that's also a big deal, right? And that decan of Taurus is really about learning from our past mistakes and remedying old things. So like a shocking awareness that helps us to move on from something that had brought us challenges in the past, maybe through no fault of our own too. Like I've been going through a student loan challenge recently where I've been carrying a student loan debt for 2+ decades. I mean, I date myself, but I finally found a way to consolidate it back into a program that might eventually give me credit for payments that will lead towards early, like, forgiveness of the loan. So it's like, which would be great. Like, that would be awesome. But it was through getting involved in like a private loan company that had exploitive practices, which was driving people and customers into repayment plans that ballooned their interest and doubled the debt. So it's fixing something that was maybe not necessarily my fault. It was just something that was an exploitive practice of the system. And I think that's what we're seeing with Jupiter and Uranus. Like, big systemic problems are that have been affecting us for a long time, potentially being liberated from them by repairing a situation. So Devin's here in the chat. What's up, Devin?
Hi, Devin. Oh man, Devin's so good. It's interesting. I just want to point out that on the heels of this eclipse season, my friend Brian Foreman and I were like, oh, let's do this like really fun podcast about psychedelic protocols for the eclipse season. Like, isn't this interesting? And like, we recorded it, we waited too late and it was such a disaster. We were like literally swept into the chaos. And I've been thinking about like, wow, this has been like a really psychedelic experience. So we're all like, having our like hearts opened and like seeing our demons. It's been like wild.
Yeah.
And where am I going with this? Coming out of all this, it just feels like we're just this whirlwind. But even speaking to the the Jupiter Uranus conjunction, it's just been so much. The one theme that keeps coming up for me is really showing how, and maybe this goes back to your idea, this idea that astrology isn't us, but it's these events we're all kind of reacting to. And if it's shown me one thing this month, it's we're all in this together, right? Like, even if it's not hitting your chart in a sensitive point, like, I don't know anybody who's living their best life right now. It feels like, even speaking to these bigger, big global things going on, it's like none of us can escape the sky.
Yeah, I mean, there's some pretty heavy stuff going on in the world right now. It's we're still all recovering from the trauma of a global health crisis, number one. We have unrest in Middle Eastern countries, and we're all dealing with the fallout from colonialism and late stage capitalism and oligarchies and authoritarian regimes starting to take over. We're feeling disconnected through, isolation, through our lives becoming more digital and more like separated on some level. There's also just a million distractions where, we're trying to sort fact from fiction, where the kind of, I don't know, sometimes it's difficult to know what is real and what isn't with the voices that are coming within social media, news, and all of those things. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I'm not going down that rabbit hole. But I do think that there is just a lot of noise that we're trying to sort through and figure out how to just live with each other and find ways to cooperate and have a shared reality. That's what's becoming more and more difficult as we move into this astrological weather, is agreeing on our shared reality, which is basically what culture is your agreed upon shared reality. And that's becoming a lot more difficult to do. And that's concerning to me a little bit.
Yeah. Thinking about that in the context of the month we've just been going into, the eclipses, especially maybe the Scorpio full moon, I thought something you said, this idea that we don't really know, like, death is difficult for us. And I think maybe so in the same way that this has been a very difficult month, it's also been really important, right? There is a sense of like, maybe we all just need like 3 days of collective mourning for whatever it is.
Yeah, and that's a great way to think about the full moon. So that's a great point. Like, 5 of Cups, Scorpio 1, a lot of what they talk about within that decan is ritualizing your mourning. So like, if we look at that card, we've got the 5 of Cups here, where we see someone who is mourning 3 spilled cups, but has 2 cups still standing behind them. So there's both the acknowledgement of what has been lost, but also the ability to have gratitude for what is still supporting us and what remains. I do think that there is a tendency in New Age spirituality to want to move on from the grief part of it too quickly. Like, where they're like, oh, don't get caught up in the grief, don't get caught up in the depression or whatever. You have to manifest. And that word is sort of taken on, like, I kind of roll my eyes when I hear that on some level. Because manifestation is real, but there are certain laws of nature that you have to follow that are, you can't rush those things. You know what I'm saying? Like, just like when you're planting a garden, I like nature metaphors. Nature is my best teacher. And I know that I have to plan for the future in my garden, and I can't rush that process or I'm going to destroy the process. So I think that one of the things that I find challenging about modern society is the lack of delayed gratification. Like, we want instant gratification for everything. And I think that same thing applies to grieving our losses. We want the instant gratification of, oh, what's going to make me feel better right away? How do I disassociate from this pain right away? And I think that's when we do that, we don't actually complete the grieving process, and we hang on to it, and it's still kicking around in our body. It's still in the recesses of our spirit and emotional body. And then it gets triggered again over and over again when we get reminded of that by different events that trigger our chart, like a music box triggers the little keys in the cylinder of a music box. So think of those planets in your chart and the planets that are the transiting planets are like the little tines that
Yeah.
click over. So you think about that song is being played over and over again, and if you don't like hammer that wound back in over time, or just heal it, whatever it is, file it down, whatever it is, that note is going to continue to be played. And oftentimes, and I think this is the way that, here's the dad part of the show, right? Where we
Love it.
like, I think that the way to deal with that is to understand that the way that we dealt with certain events, whether they are positive or negative, whether they're traumas or gifts in the past, in our youth, in a different stage of our life, does not necessarily work in the present. And so, like, a lot of times, the reason why our relationships get messed up is because we're repeating the patterns of relationships with our parents, you know, of like the way that we interacted with our parents, and the defense mechanisms that we had to enact to survive in our families. We enact those same defense mechanisms with our partners, and then because they're not our parents, sometimes it just doesn't work. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. It reminds me, I was having a conversation this week with Diana Rose Harper, and she said something really wonderful. I mean, she always does. She's just full of wonderful things to say. But, you know, I think there's this idea like, oh, we work out our parental stuff in relationships, and that's like not the place to do it, right? Speaking to your fact, like these are not our parents. And she said something I thought was like, aha, this moment, like, parental relationships are supposed to be built on unconditional love, right? Like our parents are supposed to love us no matter who we are. Like a lot of us don't have that, and it's fucked up and it really damages us. But like the thing about adult relationships is like it's not unconditional, right? Like if I'm mean to my partner, they don't have to be with me, nor should they be.
Yeah.
And I think I don't know, that just feels like a piece of wisdom that's come to the fore this cycle that feels really spot on.
Yeah, and I think love can be unconditional, but at the same time, you know, treating each other shouldn't be like unconditional. You shouldn't allow someone to treat you unconditionally bad, you know, just because you love them. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So healthy boundaries, like you're right. You're exactly right. The boundaries within an adult romantic or professional relationship are very different between the boundaries in a parent-child relationship, because the power dynamic wasn't equal when you were growing up. That's the key. And the power dynamic should be equal when you're in adult relationships. So I think that especially for those of us who had poor role models, we have to unlearn some of the tendencies that are actually, this is part of the gift of astrology, because the chart can show you that maybe even, like, let's say you have a challenging planet in your chart that brings you difficult circumstances. You may have learned, you know, negative reinforcing behaviors, you know, like because of having to deal with that over and over again, or because that behavior was modeled to you in your youth. Same goes for good habits. Same things go for like when you've been fortunate in your life. This is what's, I think, really interesting about charts. A lot of the times, the most entitled spoiled brats are the ones that have the awesomest charts that you've ever seen, dignity wise, because they've never had to deal with like bad stuff in their life. So I think that that's one of the things that's really fascinating to see. Good dignity in a chart does not mean that your character is good. It just means that you might have received better fortune, quote unquote, based on what ancient astrologers would deem good fortune coming to you, right? So that also you have to contextualize it through the lens that it's coming through. But I've seen some people with what you would look at as the most difficult, ill-dignified charts, and they're some of the best people I've ever met because they've had to develop survival skills. They've had to develop resiliency because they haven't had everything just handed to them on a silver platter. You know, my astrology teacher used to say, like, with exalted planets, what goes up must come down. So, like, I think that if you exalt your ego, you can still experience a big downfall, right? Then this is true for the two of us, CB, because we have exalted lights. Like I have the exalted moon, you have the exalted sun. So we have to watch ourselves as Leo risings, right? As not to get too puffed up, or we can experience humiliating events as well, right?
Totally. And it's, you know, I keep thinking of this, just like this eclipse is ego death, right? Because not only is it, a solar eclipse, but it's like the sun at its like most exalted by like decan, by degree, whatever. And yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. Like, the sky keeps us in check. The other part of what you're saying too is this idea of like the cyclical thing, I don't know. I've been like really into thinking about like parts work therapy a lot this month, and maybe also like binging on Jason Holly, like the way that he sort of thinks about mythology and that overlap between like the therapeutic and the astrological.
Sure.
But something that came up too is like, it's not like when we look at a chart, right? Like we often do this with clients, I'm sure you do, and you go, okay, like, well, what were you doing, right? Like for 19 years ago, for instance, when the last time we had this eclipse in this part of the sky, right? Okay, like what were you doing? But I think the other question is like, who were you? Because the person, like, life is kind of short, right? Like, I don't know, I was much younger 19 years ago. And so it's not only that like, was my life different, but I was a different person responding to that eclipse. And now I have to go back and go, okay, like, who am I now? What's my relationship to that person? Who's actually like, whose voice?
What year was that? What year was that?
Oh God.
Like the math in my head. 2007,
2005 or
2006? Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. Like mid-20s, right? Like
2004,
2004.
2005.
Yeah, Devin always helps us out with that. Like, thanks, Devin. But think about just thinking about what we were just discussing about the planets as experiences.
Yeah.
Think about the experiences we've had since we were 20 or 25 years old, right? There's been a lot of life we've lived that has taught us different, like, ego experiences, different ways of handling challenging things. I really love looking at the Saturn cycle like this, where a lot of the challenges of the Saturn cycle come to you in your youth, and then you have one lens that you deal with it with your first Saturn return, and then you have a completely different lens that you're looking at similar challenges really at the second Saturn return. So I really do believe that we are capable of having a different response to the similar planetary energies. And maybe that, drives us in the direction of more modern evolutionary type astrology. But I think that there's a way to look at traditional Hellenistic astrology in a way that can promote agency. And I keep coming back to this way of looking at fate, Vivi. It's like the three types of fate. The Hemermene, which is the fate that you're really is immovable. It's what you're born into, the family that you're born into. It's the parents that you were born into. And I know that there's arguments that you can choose your family on some level, but there are certain immutable things.
You can't help where you're born, right? Like I can have chosen family, but like I can't escape people I was raised with.
Yeah, and I was born in a certain place, and that is an immutable type of thing. So I think that that's one form of it. The second form is called a Ananke, which is Ananke basically means the force that compels like the world to spin, on its axis. But we can also think about that as the planets influencing us through our ignorance, right? So we created our charts basically because we were reacting to these stimuluses in certain ways. And that's what 90% of the people in the world are doing. They're living out their charts in an Ananke, being compelled to live out the themes and whatnot. And really, the last part is where the liberation part comes in. That's called pronoia. That's the type of fate that you create through your foresight or your foreknowledge. So our understanding of astrology can help prepare us for when the moment hits, being able to choose a different reaction in that moment. Right? Like if we know, like for example, there's one kind of scary aspect coming up in July, right? The Mars-Uranus conjunction in Taurus, which I've got kind of circled, If we know that has a possibility for maybe rash behavior or arguments, or because it's on Algol, maybe losing our heads, in anger, there's things that you can do leading up to that to be able to mitigate that experience. Like to be able to say, okay, I'm going to give myself extra space. I'm going to practice extra self-care during that period of time. I'm going to slow down and I'm not going to react right after I experience the event. I'm going to think it through, maybe even have some detachment from the situation, and then be able to come to it from a centered place, so that maybe you would avoid some of the worst of the unexpected accidents, arguments, separations that could get really ugly under an auspice like that if you didn't know any better.
Yeah, it's this entire month, I think, one of the themes that's been coming up for me is astrology at its essence, personally, right? For me, is most important in that it reflects our present moment, right? So if I'm like in the throes of it, right? Everyone else around me is like, before I had astrology, I was like, great, I'm just losing my mind, or life is like, this is, I'm in a depression. I can't see out. Like, it never gets better. Like, I was like, what the fuck is going on? And I've had moments in my life where I was just like, just like torn up, because I just thought that things shifted and they're not going to shift back. But like, it's most simplistic, right? Like knowing like, oh no, like we're going, the sun went out. It's going to be a dark period. This is difficult. We're all sort of being put to our bedrooms to like look at ourselves and figure out like what we need to let go of, who we're going to be. But just by the simple fact of like knowing like that's where I am is so powerful, because then we can go, oh, this isn't forever. And that, to me, now that you put it in these terms, is like astrology is such the gorgeous way to access that third part of fate.
Yeah, totally. I agree 100%. I think that having an end date to a painful experience is actually helps us with our resiliency, because it gives us a light at the end of the tunnel. It gives us hope that this too will change. It also, on the another feature of that is it prepares us for moments of good fortune. It prepares us for being able to take action when the soil is fertile. Like, so if you've prepared, let's use our garden metaphor again.
Yeah.
Let's say you've bought the seeds, you've made a plan, you've prepared the soil by removing the rocks and by tilling it, or whatever you do to prepare your soil. You will learn as a gardener and as a food grower that there's a certain time where it's important to plant it, or you might miss your window and the harvest that you may receive may not be as bountiful. So there's a harvest or a planting period. Taurus too is a great time to plant seeds. That's like the sowing time, like the second 10-degree section of Taurus, which is coming up, because planting during that is after a frost. It's not in danger of dying from something that could threaten it, and it gives it the most amount of light, heat, and moisture to be able to grow by the end of harvest season, which is like Virgo season basically. So I think that timing is everything. The Greeks called that kairos, the opportune moment. And there was the little cherub that had a little lock of hair on the front of his forehead. And you could only catch kairos from the front. They say not even Zeus himself can catch kairos from behind. If you miss your moment, sometimes we do miss our moments. And astrology helps prepare us for when the moment is right. And we got to say, hey, it's time for us to act right now. Now, that being said, there will be moments that come back around. Like, there are certain moments that don't. Like, there are longer cycles that where, here's an example with Jupiter Uranus. This is an aspect that doesn't happen all the time. And in my opinion, since Jupiter is part of the solar team of planets, Jupiter requires us to take an action to bring about good fortune, whereas Venus sometimes is, requiring us to maybe open up to receiving that good fortune as related to the lunar sect, which is related to 2K rather than daimon or spirit. 2K is the random distributions of fortune. So to me, Jupiter Uranus says, hey, is there an action that you can take to help facilitate this good fortune moving forward? So like in my student loan example, if I had just left my loan with the private company, there's no way that acceleration of forgiveness would have happened. I had to take the action to fill out the forms and say, okay, I've got to transfer this to this place. I've got to make sure I got all my details right. I had to take an action to allow it to be unleashed, to allow that freedom to meet me. I had to meet it halfway, right? So there are times when you can miss a big opportunity like that, but there are times when things circle back around. Like if you were planning on oh, I don't know. Like if you wanted to plant a garden this year
Yeah.
and you want to do it in Taurus season, but life just conspired against you, it will
Yeah.
come around again in 365 days and you could try again next year during Taurus season, right? So,
Totally. It's complicated because like, yes, absolutely not to miss your moment. And that's astrology shows us those. And then we have to be careful not to go into like self-sabotaging behavior of like, I missed the moment, right?
totally.
Maybe there's that moment, but there will be more moments. And as you were talking, right, what I could feel the sun in my chart, which feels like it's been depressed all month, just like getting excited, like, oh, I can take action, I can do things.
Right.
And we know that when a planet joins the sun, we said it's Kazemi, it's reborn in the heart of the sun. And so I think there's something like really special. It's like, well, what happens when the sun is eclipsed by the moon, right? It's a certain sort of like, it's like the sun has to like go through a little ego death so that it like hopefully can come back brighter with renewed vision. So maybe there's like that like benefit for all of us. And it really does feel that the astrology of May feels a little easier. And it's like, oh, maybe we're going to get our new vision for our solar vigor.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, I don't know if easy is the right word, but I think it's probably going to be less intense than the eclipse season for sure. I mean, we're seeing a Jupiter Cazimi in the heart of the sun in May, which I think is a really nice feature. Unfortunately, we do start off the month with a Venus-Pluto square, so that there might be a little bit of tension in the beginning of the month. But I think that when we saw Jupiter move into conjunction with Uranus,
Yeah.
I saw an aspect in traditional astrology called besiegement or malefic enclosure.
Yeah.
So we went through Venus's malefic enclosure where Saturn and Mars are on either side of the body of Venus. Now, in this case, the malefic enclosure happens through Saturn and Mars casting an aspect ray on either side of Jupiter for a short period of time. And it's a sextile, so it's not like a super difficult one in my opinion. But what it does is it's going to ask us to be patient about releasing the old situation. And there might be like more paperwork to fill out. You might have to be patient with the process. You may have to go through a bureaucratic system or something like that. But I do think that in May, the new moon in Taurus breaks up the malefic enclosure of Jupiter. So I think that I really feel like that's a huge watershed moment for moving forward. I know that a lot of times we say, oh, the Aries new moon's a great time to make new starts. Because it's an eclipse, though, it's distorted. You know what I'm saying? There's challenges to it. I believe there's astrologers in the ancient texts that say that the nodes disrupt the houses that they're in, that they're kind of like creating these like negative influences within those houses. I can't necessarily argue with that. I do think that if I'm trying to be more objective about it, I don't think any astrology, quote unquote, is bad. We ascribe ethical meaning to it. But I do think that there are certain shared experiences that we have as human beings that we can agree on kind of suck. There's other ones that we can agree on are kind of pleasant and kind of nice. But your mileage may vary with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Someone invited me to do like a treasure map for like a manifesting thing for this Aries new moon. And I'm down for whatever, but I was like, not during eclipse season.
I think you and I were texting each other during the eclipse and be like, are you hiding? I'm hiding.
Are you hiding?
Like, yeah,
I was in a bunker, like a spa bunker. Like I was in a Korean spa, no windows, surrounded by water. And you were where?
I was just in my house with the blinds down. I didn't go stare at it. Like I know that other people have different thoughts about that. And I have no problem if people have different beliefs around that. Part of my little piece of superstition is that you really shouldn't look into them, whether you have those glasses or not. Like the ancients would consider those baleful rays, and whether that's true or not, I always tend to err on the side of caution. And maybe it is, or maybe it isn't, but it wasn't worth it to me to be like, oh wow, I can see this thing for like 30 minutes. It's not worth it for that to just absorb into my body. Like I do the ritual practices that like they talk about with Sphere and Sundry, with like taking a salt bath so that the negativity doesn't stick to you. We do rituals in this house to to Durga and to Rahu, and like do the chanting and prayers, to be able to like honor the demon slayer, Durga, like, so seriously, like,
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing with you.
and that's part of my practice. So I feel like that helps me stay centered,
Yeah.
because in that Eastern spiritual tradition, Rahu is not a nice thing. Like we look at, that's where we really differ from evolutionary astrology with traditional astrology and Vedic astrology, Jyotisha, is those nodes, the North Node, the hunger, the desire for more attachment on the physical plane is what keeps you in bondage. That's what keeps you in, in servitude. And they exalt the South Node on some level because it's actually releasing that bondage and helping you come closer to spirit or to God or the divine. So I kind of like the South Node a little bit better on regards.
Can I share? I had the most, like, I've been having all month, like, really difficult sleep, but I had a wild dream about the South Node. May I share it with you?
Mm-hmm. Please.
I shared it with some other people last night, and they didn't, like, just, I referenced Karen Carpenter, which I hope you know Karen Carpenter.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Beautiful voice.
The younger people don't know Karen Carpenter, but it's a little context here for my story. Karen Carpenter, how would you, I'll let you describe her. You're a musician. How would you?
So part of one half of the group, the Carpenters, right? A gorgeous voice. I believe she was a Pisces sun, ? She was also a very talented drummer. I don't know if you've seen the circulating videos of that, but really just a smooth, clear, pure tone to her voice, but struggled a lot with, she had an eating disorder that she struggled with that eventually killed her.
Yep.
And yeah, those are the main things that my understanding of Karen Carpenter.
And Todd Haynes, the director, did, I think maybe while still in college, a film about her called Superstar, where it was the Karen Carpenter story told with Barbie dolls. So just, shout out to Todd Haynes for like the first Barbie film. But anyway, all of that comes into my dream. So in my dream, I'm in this like attic, right? Like the top floor of a bungalow, which is maybe sort of similar to my childhood home. And I'm like, just like, it's not like a hoarder house, but there's like a bunch of just like junk. It's bringing to mind the that scene in The Labyrinth, right, where it's like the house. Someone brought that up. My friend Naomi, like the house made of junk, but it feels kind of cozy. So I'm in this this attic, but the crazy thing is, it's been like blasted off, like it's been beheaded from the rest of the house. So I'm literally like in this floating attic, and just kind of like cozy. And I look out the window, and just Karen Carpenter appears, and she starts singing like Rainy Days and Mondays. Okay. And then she stops, and a voiceover comes on. And it's like, the South Node of the moon is where we release from the material. The South Node of the moon is where we release our pain. And I woke up being like, oh, I get it now. Mm-hmm. I totally get it now. Also, really fucked up that my psyche like brought in Karen Carpenter that way, but perfect.
What does Karen Carpenter mean to you, though? What is your experience with her?
Well, I was thinking about someone who, like, just this idea, like, literally who's, who struggled with hunger, right? That feels so spot on for the South Node. Someone who is constantly, I mean, she was a bulimic, right? So if someone who's like literally like that feels so symbolic of the South Node, right. South Node being sort of the shitter in the opposite direction, right? But it's this idea of like this symbol of like someone for, releasing.
And in that regard, the previous Libra eclipse that we had was very close to the South Node. So releasing the need to get other people's approval is part of that, I think, eclipse series as well. Or even the releasing our ability to have completely equal win-win situations. That's kind of a hard reality sometimes, is that there are certain situations where there is a winner and there is someone who is not, benefiting equally. And those are the toughest situations to navigate. That being said, though, like, this is where our paranoia comes in.
Yeah.
just because we're going through an Aries Libra eclipse season, you know, and the new moon solar eclipse in Aries,
Yeah.
again, it doesn't mean that we have to like say, fuck everyone else and I'm just going to do exactly what I
No,
want the whole
no.
time, you know? Because I think that there's a lot of like manifestors that are like, you just be yourself and you do what you want to do and like don't care what other people think. Because that, I mean, yes, it's important to have an inner compass, but we also live in a society that where we have to, you know, live with other people. Everyone else is going through that exact same influence of trying to get their own needs met. And this is why we have conflicts internationally, personally, etc., is when we can't communicate properly about what our needs are and we don't take into consideration that other people have the exact same needs that we might.
Yeah. At first, I want to say, no, I'm not, I did not mean to speak poorly about eating disorders or anything like that. I just thought it was like the symbolism was spot on. So,
Sure.
but also, yeah, thinking about that, just speaking of like the South Node and the pain in the when we try to hold on to the material world, or the pain we try to hold on to things that are not happening for us anymore. But to speak to what you're saying, I think also this idea of like, fuck it, this is like Aries energy about being like, this is the me time. I think, speaking as someone who has an Aries sun, one of the more devastating like pieces of pop culture astrology is this idea that like the lone wolf Aries, right? You go at it alone. And I think that, you know, having, you know, I see a lot of people who are going through it and they're like, I just need to be alone. And I'm like,
Right.
being independent does not mean being alone, right? Like my whole life, everyone's like, well, you're an Aries, you're solo. And it's like, no, that's really damaging to people, right? Like
Totally.
being alone, right? Or being independent does not mean you're like forced to a life of solo
So
practitioner.
so Vivi, check this out. This is another story that has started to kind of come through my consciousness about Aries in particular.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's building off of what you're speaking towards. Every part of the zodiac is a temporary resting place, right?
Mm.
So Aries is a temporary condition. It is not a permanent condition. So like if we take our nature metaphor, the seed in Aries season has, you know, yang energy to push up through the surface, but it's not to just keep pushing up through the surface
Yeah.
indefinitely. It pushes up through the surface so that it can start spreading, so that the roots then can now go further down. Like in Taurus season, it can have a stable foundation. Its leaves start to flourish. The flowers begin to bloom, and those flowers, Gemini season, start attracting other beings, and they are part of an ecosystem. They are not just an individual little plant there. They are part of an interconnected, woven tapestry of life. And Aries is, even if you're an Aries sun, if you're Aries placements, you are part of a rich tapestry of community all around you, of relationships, of, you know, I mean, that to me was a really important light bulb moment, is just
Yeah.
seeing that that's just one phase in the cycle, and that you are, it is necessary. We can't avoid it. Okay, if we avoid that Aries energy, then we'll never bust through the surface and we'll stay hidden in darkness. So it serves a purpose. But let's say Vivi, sorry, I'm getting used to
I go
your
by
name.
all
Okay.
things. We're good.
So Vivi, you probably had situations in your life where you had to be forced to rely on your own initiative because of maybe even potentially being not having the support that you needed. You had to rely on your own power and your own yang force. Okay, so you learned that as a skill based on your maybe even traumas growing up. Like, and when we say that, and we contextualize it within the sun as being exalted and being, oh wow, you probably have an amazing life or something like that. That doesn't always mean that the beginning of people's lives was amazing. They may have had to learn some really important lessons through very difficult experiences.
Mhm.
And then, you know, it doesn't have to be a permanent condition. Like, so let's say that you, and am I touching
Yeah.
on?
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
So let's say you had to learn to fight for your own independence within your
Mhm.
own situation, because maybe you were raised in a violent household, or maybe you had a parent figure that was not present or something like that, and then you're taking that same energy to your adult relationships in circumstances that it might not be an appropriate expression, right? And that could cause problems in your life rather than helping you move towards what you need to move towards. Now, that doesn't take away the fact that you have that skill within you. It just
Yeah.
means that you're learning when to deploy that skill and when not to. But that skill is already a part of you. There may be situations where you are helping other people to burst through the surface, you know?
Yeah.
And, I mean, you've got a really interesting chart. You have some sensitive stuff in your chart, like Mercury and Pisces, that I think mitigates some of the, I don't know, maybe some of the lack of compassion that people accuse Aries placements of having. Like, I don't always get that from you. I get a lot of sensitivity and compassion through the way that you communicate. So,
I think, that happens when you've struggled with say mental illness. Is there a better word for mental illness?
I
Mental
mean,
challenges your whole life. But
sure.
it's interesting what that brings up again too, is this idea that like we aren't our charts, right? So maybe growing up in a violent household, using example of like that, having to learn how to fight, right?
Yeah.
That can be, it's like in therapy people talk about like the you keep having the same reactions, they no longer serve you. Or if there's something like with addictions or something, usually it comes from something that would protected you at some point but becomes like destructive, right? So it's the same
Totally.
idea that like when you're in relationships and you're constantly like, I can't trust anybody because I feel like, I'm threatened, right? Astrology can remind us to like, well, look around.
Hmm.
You're not the same person. You're not in the same place, right?
Right.
We're different people. The circumstances are different.
And it doesn't mean that you were wrong in the past. Like,
Mm-mm.
that's the other thing too. A lot of people will self eviscerate because of their behavior in the past, or like the quality that they don't like about themselves. But you were doing the best that you could in the moment with the
Yeah.
skills that you had, as a young person, like trying to figure out how to just continue to live, basically, right? So there's a strong sense of forgiveness that's important, inherent in this type of thinking, where when you release those old habits and behaviors, do it with love for your former self, not with like saying, "Oh, I was such a bad person," or whatever. It's saying, "Oh, I care about you, little person, and that was appropriate for that time, but we don't need to do that anymore. We don't need to react in that way." So, but yeah, it's there is some interesting things about getting older, Vivi, that are where you start to see things just from different lenses, different perspectives, and I do think that that's where the growth comes in.
Yeah.
I think that we're obsessed with evolving and in new age circles, and like, oh, we have to always be better versions of ourselves. And I don't necessarily think that's true, but I do think that we can learn how to deal with life in a way that creates less stress for us and for others. And that can bring us peace of mind and satisfaction. I think that those are the kind of things that are important to me. And I know that that's not going to make my life perfect, and it doesn't mean I'm going to level up or something like that. It just
Yeah.
means that I'm able to navigate my life maybe more gracefully than I had in the past. And there's
Hey,
different challenges at different stages of life.
oh God, amen. And it's interesting too, thinking about like times like this, really like when there is so much changing, really, I don't know, like that's to put another way, you were speaking earlier about challenging charts, making great character. Um, like really great things happen during bad astrology and reminding ourselves of that.
Yeah.
Also, Devin has some amazing, I'm going to read some of Devin's comments because they're really good. Um, so Devin is letting us know that Karen Carpenter had the South Node in Libra in the fourth conjunct Mars. Like, okay, that's
Yeah.
right on for
Perfect.
my dreaming. I love this too. Pisces is the water and nutrition in the soil, right? So
Hmm.
Pisces providing the nutrients for that Aries growth.
Right. And then yeah, Devin has a lot of great insights. He's a a really deep thinker and has a lot to offer in the chats and whatnot. So I'm always happy to see him pop up here. And he also says, because we are our charts, but that's only one lens to look at the charts through. The charts aren't only us. That is a really important insight right there that Devin's pointing out, is that the planets, because I think of astrology as divination, that those same symbols are multivalent. They can represent different things. They can represent parts of our psyche. They can represent events in our life. They can represent people in our life that aren't us. You know, I often will look at somebody's moon sign to be like, you know, what was your mother like? You know, what, or the sun or Saturn is what was your father like? In addition to looking at like the fourth and the 10th house rulers. So, you know, it is very interesting to see that the divine can meet, it's trying to meet us in where our consciousness is at, in my opinion. And that Jeffrey Cornelius book, The Moment of Astrology, really shifted a lot of things for me. Wasn't that a great book? Right?
I loved that book.
Yeah, just showing us that astrology itself doesn't even have to be completely tied to, first of all, to hard and fast rules, number one. And second of all, to time itself, right? Like there's sometimes when a chart can speak to you, even if it is disconnected from the particular time that you're living in that moment. Now, it is connected to time because a chart is always a reflection of a moment in time. But one moment in time in like the 1850s, if you see it in a book tomorrow, could speak to you about your current situation. And that to me is magic.
Yeah, I mean, that book just was so important for how I think about astrology, but also like making sense of the fact there is no one right astrology, right? It's why I think the example he uses is like, you know, when a client gives you the wrong time and you have the wrong chart, but somehow you still get the right information, or why I can sit with a chart and pick up on something, but my friend who's maybe an evolutionary astrologer could be looking at different things and still come to the same conclusion, because there is something that's like that divinatory process of the oracle speaking.
Absolutely. And that is a huge point of growth, I think, when you are becoming a traditional astrologer in particular, is there's a lot of when we like for me, I'm just going to speak from my own experience. When I was going from being a modern astrologer, a modern amateur, I would say that, like an enthusiastic modern amateur, to discovering traditional astrology, there's a lot of things in your brain to be like, oh wow, I was doing this wrong before. You know what I'm saying? Because there's a lot of teachers out there like that too that said, oh well, you didn't get the real stuff. And you know, it's funny because we can buy into that myth and that lie, I guess, for a period of time. And then oftentimes what you'll see if you're paying attention is you'll cycle back around. You know, you'll eliminate something and be like, oh, I reject this. And then you'll start incorporating things back in to be able to like, oh, well, I can still see it from that perspective. Because when I was an enthusiastic amateur, I still had deep connections with people at the grocery store or at parties when I would like ask them their birth time and we'd have deep conversations about their life that seemed fairly accurate. But I do think that what traditional astrology does is just gives us a shared language that I feel has an organization to it that helps us to have a rational system that where, for me, it's taken less of the guesswork out of astrology, where I think that sometimes when I was doing modern astrology, there was a little bit more reliance on just my intuitive faculties, whereas it's kind of hard to avoid the truths within the chart that are based on the systemic organization of reading a chart, you know, that I see now. That being said, I use tarot, I use I-Ching, I use animals, I use outer planets. Like I call it integrative divination. Like there's so many different ways to look at a chart. And when we start to say that our way is the only way, that's when we, I think, are becoming the charlatan and not being open to the multiplicity of the ways that the divine can speak.
I just, multidisciplinary divination, something sort of I adhere to too, but I studied traditional astrology as my first real form of astrology before I even did tarot. And so, I think I came from teachers that were like, this is how you do it, like in a very like rule based, which is very, very important to my understanding of structure, like structural understanding of astrology. But man, like picking up a tarot deck and making a friend with the tarot, to me is like the one way to like humble yourself. You're like,
Totally.
I don't even know where this is coming from, and somehow it's right.
I mean, nature does that for me. Like just studying the natural world and like the symbols that animals and plants and clouds and rain can bring you. That to me is the true humility for me. Like when I see an eagle fly over and I go look up what an eagle might, what its habitat is like, what food it eats, what its habits are like, and I'm able to connect the habits of the eagle with what I'm going through in my life. That's the essence of divination, is being able to see one thing as another. So if you want to be able to practice this, don't get fixated on a system. Learn to be able to see in figurative language, to see one thing as representing another. And that could be anything. That's why people, here's the thing, that's why people read the entrails of like cows or goats back in the day. Because they were like, all right, I can see this pattern, and this pattern reminds me of this thing I'm going through in my life or could go through in my life. And it doesn't mean that they were wrong. It just means that that's what they were meeting the divine through those animal entrails, right? And I think the key with this is being consistent with saying, okay, I've made an agreement that when I see this, this is what it means. And again, I'm even going to backtrack with that too. That can evolve over time as well. A symbol can evolve over time. But I do think consistency with like saying, okay, when I see this, I know that's what I'm connecting to. That is very helpful for not just like flailing and be like, oh, this could mean a million things. Like I know, for example, when I see like an eagle, I literally had a bald eagle fly past my back window in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which they're here, but it's not very common to see them buzz your window in a very urban environment. Yeah. And I was thinking a lot about like resources and things of that nature. And the eagle teaches us to rise above some of the mundane concerns and to reconnect with spirit and to be able to dive into the intuition or the feelings that water represents. They're fish birds, right? They're fish raptors. They dive into the intuitive waters. Waters represents something that is below the surface, intuition, subconsciousness. Whereas, an animal that eats something very different would give you a different method. Like a camel, for example. I pulled the camel the other day, and the camel lives in a very harsh environment, but they carry a lot of water with them over long distances. They have adaptability. They have the ability to eat very harsh materials. They carry water with them. They have their own knowledge that they carry with them. So they don't necessarily need to rely on other people, and they can carry heavy burdens long distances. So that's a very different energy for, like, let's say you were having an issue. Yes. I don't know. What's an issue that someone could have? Like, throw one out there.
Someone is just like lost their job, for example.
So there's two, like, let's use those two symbols as an example. Yeah. If they see an eagle, it could be like spirit communicating to them saying, hey, maybe we've gotten a little bit too attached to our current material reality, and we need to rise above it and reconnect with meaning in our life to be able to move you forward. If you get the camel as a symbol for that same exact issue, it may be saying, hey, you've got everything that you need within you. You have to become more resilient and adaptable. It may be a little bit tough going for a period of time, but but you're a survivor, right? Those are subtle differences, but I do think that they speak to a little bit of a different approach to a similar problem.
Yes, and this is a sneak peek for a future conversation, but I think what you're getting at too is this idea that this symbolism is relational, right? So like when people are learning tarot, for instance, and they're constantly like looking things up, and it's like, no, you really need to develop a relationship. Like, what is your relationship to the Three of Swords, right? Like, I love that card because
context.
Yeah, right. Like someone getting married, is someone breaking up, is it raining outside? It could be anything, but like so finding your own relationship to that card, but then also like, for instance, you pulled a camel, and this is a card that an animal you've worked with. Right. So not only are you pulling on, when you get the camel, right? It's not pulling, it's context, yes, but it's not only just this idea that this is an animal that's well resourced and can carry things, endure hard times through its own sort of capabilities. But every time you pull the camel, you're pulling on the stories of every other time you pulled the camel. And I think that's why this is so important, because we build we give life to these symbols, and we're part of the process.
Well, and if you take that a step further, let's say you had a camel as a toy that your grandfather gave you when you had some sort of experience, and you are making associations with that particular time and your ability to be resilient within that time. So you're spot on. Context matters so much, and it matters in a chart too. When we try to isolate placements in an astrological chart, I think we're going in with like one eye covered, because we're not seeing how it's relating to the host of that planet, to the topic and the terrain that it's working through, how the other planets are relating to it. I always, when I do a reading, I always have a conversation with people about the context of their life. That's what we do in intake forms. To me, the people who try to cold read as astrologers, I think that's just like, look at how many rules I've memorized. Do you know what I'm saying? And because the chart can say different things based on the different questions that you are asking it. Do you see what I'm saying? So while the fourth house could be dad, the fourth house can also represent your home. So if someone is asking a question about, well, is my home in good shape right now? Or that's a very different question than, is my dad in good shape right now? Or am I going to have a good reconnect with my dad? Or, you have to ask the right questions of the chart and then see how it's all communicating in this cosmic symphony.
And this is the divination part, right? Like, I've done so many cold readings in my life, but cold readings, I think the key to cold readings are being able to tap into relationship with that person right away, right? Like, we're in this together. What is it you're going through? What am I trying? Like, what's trying to come out of the chart at this particular moment? So like, if I'm doing a cold reading, I'm not going to like go through your year ahead and know the whole thing, but there's going to be a story that's going to come out. And I think that speaks to the thing beyond astrology, right? Like, my astrology tools can't get me there. It's this something else that allows me to actually share a container with that person.
Yeah. I mean, the cold reading, if someone needs to establish trust with you, as far as like have it proven to them that you actually know something, then that can be appropriate. But I dispense with all that pretense and be like, look, do you want a reading or not? Like, you've seen my work online? Like, is this like, this is part of our Leo rising? Like, do you want me to help you or not? Like.
Oh, I agree. It's not my
right.
Like, if people are going through crisis, there's been plenty of times where I'm just like, okay, we're here.
But what it does though is it does help you to create intimacy with your client and say, hey, now that I know your story, now that I know what it is that we're trying to uncover, here is a way to look at that problem through the mythological archetypal languages. Here's how this particular spirit or daimon or god resolved a problem in this spiritual tradition. And that can give them insight into dealing with a problem in a similar way in their life. Like, for example, like, we're coming up, we haven't talked about Jupiter and Gemini. Jupiter in Gemini is an expansion of options, right? And we may feel paralysis through that expanding options. Jupiter in Sagittarius tends to like to go towards a singular focus. And when we have a planet of faith in being hosted by a planet of doubt, that can be a little bit disorientating, right? That being said, if we look at the story of the Discovery, the Castor and Pollux, the twins, one of those twins died in a fight with another set of twins and had to sacrifice part of his time on Olympus and part of his immortality so that the other twin could live again. So if we take that and we apply that to a situation in our life, you may have a number of different directions that you could head in, but you may have to sacrifice one of those directions so that you can breathe life into the one that is most important to you in that moment, or that is your highest priority. And that's knowing that makes it okay to say, this is the priority. This one it's not going to fly. I can't keep them both going. And that gives almost like your mind permission to say, all right, I'm not a bad person if I can't keep juggling all of these, competing interests.
My favorite Gemini phrase, and I believe I get this from Austin Coppock, said like during a class, is the thing with Gemini is learning that you can do all the things, just not at once.
Totally.
So Jupiter and Gemini really opening that up. Okay, like I want to do all the things, but where do I start? One thing at a time, or else I'm just going to be, right, the person who does everything is the person who does nothing.
As a person with Venus in Gemini and a Virgo stellium, I have Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in Virgo. The square between those I've often compared to breathing. The Gemini phase is being able to breathe in information. It's breathing in, it's collecting the pollen like the bee does, right? And it's okay to go through a phase of that. And there are going to be different parts of a project that you're working on where you're collecting information. But then you have to go through the processing part of that, where the Virgo part of it says, how do we turn that pollen into honey? How do we turn it into something useful that is providing us with sustenance? And then how do we discard the things that aren't meaningful, the things that aren't serving us, the superfluous information that doesn't apply to this particular situation? But that doesn't end there. It's a continual process. Breathing in, Gemini. Processing and discarding, Virgo. Breathing in and out, in and out. And different stages of your project will require different, intake and output, right? So that's been a real revelation for me dealing with the square in my own chart, because we're going to have squares with this energy, especially with Saturn and Pisces, where that square to me is more about intake of information, surrender to not having all the answers. Intake information, surrender to not having all the answers, right? That's what it feels like.
My heart. When you were talking about the breathing, right, I just had this image, right, of Gemini as the lungs, the twins. I was like, oh, that's so perfect. The lungs where you breathe in and out. And then what would Virgo, Virgo is...
Virgo is like the stomach, maybe. I mean, like the digesting of that, or it's I don't know how we'd connect it with the lung metaphor, but think about Virgo as the process of extracting the oxygen from the air and then breathing out the carbon dioxide. It's that part of the process.
We're getting the lungs thing happening. Yeah. I like that. It's great.
You can even think of Gemini as the food that you're taking in, and then Virgo is the digestion process, and then the elimination process. And you have to keep eating every day, to keep fueling yourself. But that's why it's so important to see the zodiac as a whole, because every single sign, planet, etc., is a necessary process for human life. And that's why we can't just say, well, I'm this and I'm just this. No, you're all of it. And you're going to be different things in different moments. You may have different circumstances that are more focused in your life, but you're going through every single sign and planet can give you insight into normal human functions or natural processes.
Yes, it is. It is so much. I can't believe we've been talking for an hour and 20 minutes, and I think we've processed these eclipses. We talked, this full moon, we've kind of alluded to some of the things that are coming up. Maybe we wrap up. You have tomorrow a live stream where you're going through the astrology of May. So everyone should definitely dig into that. What are as far as May astrology goes, what's the one thing that you're most looking forward to? Some highlight.
I think it's got to start with the new moon in Taurus. From a very subjective perspective, it's in my 10th house on my natal moon, so I'm excited about that. But I do think that that's an important time period for giving and receiving, for understanding how we can build consistency into our life. And we may need that consistency when Jupiter moves into Gemini and when we move further into Gemini season. Having a bunch of healthy routines and consistent ways of going about our life where we're balancing work and play, in particular at that new moon, will help us to be able to deal with some of the anxiety that we might feel when we are presented with a number of options that we can't pursue simultaneously. So I think that that's part of it. I think that the Jupiter Cazimi on May 18th is going to be really important, especially for getting, it's going to echo the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. I think that we're going to get clarity around a situation that we started to try to process around the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. We're going to see like this rebirth of that energy. Mars is conjoining the North Node on the 19th. So that is pretty interesting to me. I've started to pay a lot more attention to planetary contacts with the nodes.
Yeah.
So keep in mind that that's going to be very much increasing your desire to make royal decrees and say, this is who I am, and I'm going to go for what I want no matter what. So that can be a good thing, but that also gives us a warning that we have a strong desire to individuate around that period of time, and we need to balance that out. There's a Venus-Jupiter conjunction on May 23rd at 29 degrees of Taurus before it moves into Gemini. So I think that that's another interesting moment. And then finally, we have the Mercury conjoining Uranus at the final degrees of Taurus as well. So we may have some really great ideas about how to remediate some challenges within our life. And then I just want to give you one thing.
Yeah.
There is a Venus Cazimi in June around the new moon on the 6th that I find very fascinating. So keep that on your radar for June, is that there will be a moment to start to integrate all of these different competing interests in the beginning of June. So in May, if you feel like, oh my God, my brain's exploding with options and directions, you'll have the moment of integration potentially in the beginning of June. So just, it's okay to live with some ambiguity in May, I think is the issue. Explore a little bit, breathe some information in. You know, that's, we tend to dismiss Gemini as like, oh, you got to focus, you got to do this. Gemini serves a purpose. Gemini is the bees that are visiting all these different flowers to collect the pollen to be able to bring it back to the hive. So it allows you to explore and to see things from a flexible perspective rather than a fixed one that we were looking at that through Taurus. So flexibility is super important through that month.
I also, just to come back to the Venus piece, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's also an astrologer this morning. And I think some of the difficulty of this Aries season, it isn't just like the sun, but like Venus has been like in a rough place.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, not dismissing like the impact that's had on people, right? Like our relationship to love, beauty, desire, connection, all of these have just been like, it's been kind of trash.
I'm really looking forward to Venus moving into Taurus at the end of this month.
Absolutely. And so then like that Venus Cazimi too, it just might be like a rebirth of Venus theme. So even just kind of like thinking about your relationship to Venus up to that Cazimi, even thinking about the time as like like, what do you want your relationship to Venus? Like even processing this whole month through Taurus season and think, you know, because Venus is still kind of burnt up by the sun, and it could be a really interesting time to think about what you want from your relationship to Venus and really having some focus on that Cazimi around that.
Yeah, CV, that Venus Cazimi new moon is exactly on my natal Venus in the 11th house. So having lived that placement, that's on a fixed star called Rigel, which is, I compare that to drinking from the fire hose of information. It's great for learning but also teaching what you've learned. So that could be part of that process. But Venus in Gemini too helps you to reconcile opposites. It says, okay, I'm going to help harmonize these very different perspectives. So you may have things in your life that are pulling you in a lot of different directions. And that Cazimi moment, it says, okay, here's how we can compromise with those different like viewpoints. Like when I'm doing the live stream, there's a lot of different types of, you know, energies, egos, etc. And one of the things that I like to do is just be like, hey, you know what? There's space for everyone to express themselves as long as you're being kind to one another, and leave space for that exploration, for being able to see things through a different lens. So I think that's a great way to prepare for that period of time, is you might be asked to harmonize multiple different viewpoints and leave some space for an opinion that might be different from yours.
Oh, I love that. That's a beautiful way to end this. Thank you so much, Spencer. This has been great. It's been just a great conversation, and it's been great to catch up with you. I haven't talked to you since I've moved to LA. Everyone who joined, like Devin, Carl, Reverend Kai, I think I'm saying that right,
Yeah.
Michelle, Mortal and Wild. This is such a lovely group of people.
Yeah.
And I think I'm in the show notes, but what's coming up for you? Your live stream tomorrow? How can people find you?
So yeah, I have a live stream where at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's a Thursday. I usually live stream every Friday, but
Okay.
I'm doing it early this week because I'm preparing for the NFL draft, which I affectionately call football Christmas. I do love watching that. My ability to project things into the future is
Yeah.
excited with all of that. But that being said, join me tomorrow, Thursday, the 25th, for a live stream for the Astrology of May, 1:30 Eastern Time. I'm also available for readings. You can find me at spencermichaud.com. And you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at Spencer Michaud. So that's a great way to follow along and know when I'm offering new classes and new live streams. I've got some educational things coming in the probably close to that Venus Cazimi on my natal Venus in the 11th house. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Sign up for my email list if you want to know when that's coming. So that's what
Yay.
I've got.
Fantastic. And I'm Vivi Henriette, Art of the Zodiac and all the places, either Vivi Henriette or Art of the Zodiac. But everyone follow me on Substack because that's where I do most of my communication. I just did a wonderful interview with this astrologer named Marvel Rex, an LA-based astrologer who's fantastic. So you can check that out. And hopefully we'll do more of these DADAstrology. We'll talk DADAstrology more in the future. And
I thought it was a new series you were creating.
I wanted to separate the talks from the astrology. So we're doing Dada astrology, but today it's DADAstrology. So thank you for being the dad for DADAstrology. Yeah, everyone follow me on Substack for more DADAstrology, also open for consultations. And with that, have a gorgeous day. Goodbye, friends.
Take care, friends.